This is Baxter Colburn, host of the Verse of the Day podcast. Thanks for listening to the following broadcast on Public House Media.
This is Bryce Burge, host of Your Soccer Passport here on Public House Media. After this episode, come join us on a trip around the soccer world as we discuss club and country every Tuesday. Stamp your soccer passport by subscribing on Spotify, iTunes, or wherever you get your Public House Media podcasts. And thanks again for checking out the following broadcast on Public House Media.
Welcome to How to Write Good. I'm your host, Daniel Poppy. You can find out more about me at danielpoppy.com. Poppy is spelled P-O-P-P-I-E. Daniel is however you want to spell it, I think. This podcast is brought to you by Public House Media, so if you would like to check them out, you can check them out on Facebook, or you can check them out at thephmedia.com, whichever you really want to do. We are going to jump right into our word of the week, and our word of the week is something that you need to know because you need to know every word. The word of the week this week is cerumen, and some of you may know what this is, or 99% of you may not. But it's actually earwax. So earwax isn't actually wax. It's wax-like, but I don't think I don't know. Would you actually classify it as wax? Maybe it is. I want to know now. But it's called cerumen, and it is earwax. So now you can talk about your earwax without sounding gross, because earwax is kind of a gross word. So I don't know how long this episode is actually going to be, but we are now on the fifth rule. Gosh, that's kind of crazy. We're now on the fifth rule of my writing rules. Again, there are 14, and each of them it becomes less and less important as you listen to it. So if you listen to the first one, good for you, because you got the biggest and most important information. Actually, you should really listen to the first two. If you haven't, because those are more important than the other ones. And actually, I would say that if you're going to skip out on any, you should get the first 5. And after that, it kind of gets into creative writing. So just to remind everyone what they are, the first 2 rules of writing is writing follows language, grammar serves meaning. These are like my golden rules. The second rule and the third and the fourth rule, are people have short memories, if you remember that, and appeal to the senses. Now we are on our 5th rule. So the 3rd, 4th, and 5th are my silver rules. So if you're going to follow the gold and silver, but if you're going to go and default back to something, definitely default back to those first 2, because then you can think and listen, and it's more than just the statement writing follows language or grammar serves meaning. There's an explanation behind it why those are the most important or what to do with those. But I think that if you're going to default back to any rules, just keep these 5 in mind as you listen to it and as you write, and you'll probably be fine when you write. Like if you just go back and you think of these and you think, okay, I need to make sure my writing actually sounds like somebody talking, right? Because people understand talking better than writing typically. Like we have to teach kids how to read correctly, but we don't necessarily have to teach them how to learn how to understand talking. Now there are certain disabilities or brain issues that you could have, or whatever, tumors in your brain or areas of your brain, if there's a deficiency or a deficit, I guess, that you could have trouble understanding someone talking, but typically you don't have that. And there are certain areas that I think govern reading, but reading isn't a natural thing. You don't just come out of the womb reading. That's what I mean. It's the same thing. It's like you don't come out of the room playing an instrument. You don't come out of the room writing. You don't come out of the room on a computer. They're not natural things. They're learned things. If they were natural, it'd be kind of bizarre, because if reading and writing was natural before there was written word, then people would already have the ability. Kind of bizarre. Actually, they do it. There wouldn't be any need to invent writing, because they'd already have writing. So again, so far we've got writing follows language, grammar serves meaning, people have short memories, and appeal to the senses, if you don't remember that. And this week is similar to the last one, but I'm going to explain it a little. It has a bit of a different nuance, and the reason why I group this with the silver ones is because I think my main goal when I write is to take an idea from my head and convey it to somebody else. Okay, my main goal is to do that. So this is really applicable to that, and it's similar to appeal to the senses. And the rule for this week is if you can't see it, you can't make your readers see it. And it's a little broader than that statement, but I think that's a good statement to remember. That's a good statement for you to understand or remember what this is. So I'm going to go back to last week. So last week I talked about this idea that if you're trying to appeal to the senses, and I talked about Piaget, and I talked about this idea how people have different stages of thinking. You go from, and you have concrete operational, then you have post-operational. And post-operational, and maybe one other after that, is like the highest form of thinking. And this is really abstract thinking. Now, the thing about it is that everybody goes into, barring very, very few individuals, but pretty much everybody goes into concrete operational. Now, what concrete operational means is that you deal with things that actually exist, right? And I think it's the case that most people do go into a level of post-operational. Most adults do. I think they do think on a higher level than children. Now, there are some people I think that think most don't, or there's a lot that don't. But it seems to be the case that a lot do, right? It seems to be the case that a lot are thinking on a different level. And I would just say that maybe this thinking on a higher level is actually it's because they've been working with the same information for so long. So someone who's been teaching a really long time, and they just see all this different nuance in teaching and see all these different things from their experience, they are thinking on that on a higher level. Or somebody who works with math, they think of math differently. Now, like what I've said in the past is that you take information, and then you have a structure you're using, and then you put information on that structure, like you're building a house, and you slowly build that house. And then finally, once you continue to do that, instead of just seeing the individual pieces, you actually see the house come together. If anyone has ever seen, if you've ever seen someone who is doing a painting upside down, it's really, really interesting. And I've seen it a couple times. So somebody is doing, it's usually one of these things where they're doing it on stage and they're doing it really quickly, and you're like, well, what's going on? What are they doing? I don't get it. And then suddenly they flip it over and you see it. And that is because that's because you suddenly recognize it as something that's going on. And that's kind of what I think the jump is from concrete operational to this formal operational. You have all these concrete pieces that you can see and touch and manipulate and different things like that. And then suddenly you are able to say, oh, okay, this is suddenly something else. It's something bigger. All these pieces come together. If you know anything about Gestalt psychology, I think it's German, but they think of this idea that the sum of the parts, the sum of the parts is greater than each of the individual parts put together. All right, I can't remember the exact phrasing of how that goes, but essentially the sum is greater than the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. That's what the statement is. It means that everything together in a bicycle is greater than just every little piece of a bicycle put together. If you want to understand it maybe a little more, if you just toss all the pieces of a bicycle. If you toss all the pieces of a bicycle in a pile, you'll have all the pieces of a bicycle, but it won't make a bicycle. I think it actually goes back to this idea of design. There's a specific design to the thing that's being used or created or whatever, the thing that you're seeing. And there's a lot of parts to that design because everything has a part, and it all goes back to that. Now, you're probably wondering, how the heck does this relate to appeal to the senses? Well, this goes back to the idea of formal operations. And we're going back to this idea of, okay, so maybe I understand a really, really complex idea. What I need to do is I need to break that down into things that people can actually touch or feel, or maybe into a metaphor like I was saying. But now we're jumping from that, we're jumping into the next rule is if you can't see it, you can't make your readers see it. Which means, well, it's actually a really simple rule if you think about it. And I think that most people would agree with me that this is something that would be the case. I think that actually, if you actually presented these rules to pretty much every writer, serious writer, someone who's done a lot of thinking about writing, they'd probably be like, yeah, these rules make a lot of sense. And I'm not trying to puff myself up about it. It's just like my intention was to be like, what are the rules that if for these first 5 especially, the other ones maybe not so much, but what are the rules that if you are writing are going to apply to all situations, and these 5 do. So here's something that you can think about. So if you've ever, this happens to me a lot. I read a book, and the book is really interesting, and it's typically a book that's philosophizing. So it's not a book that's it's not fiction. Typically, I don't have trouble understanding fiction, and I think the reason why people typically don't have trouble understanding fiction is because everything is put in concrete terms. Because if you have fiction that's not put in concrete terms, it doesn't really make a lot of sense. But what is happening when somebody writes a book that is philosophizing about something is they're taking things and they're explaining it to somebody else, and someone who does it really well is putting it into concrete terms. But what they're doing is they're taking all those concrete terms and they're painting a picture of that actual thing, which probably, like, the concrete terms aren't that actual thing, but it's creating a parallel that somebody can understand. Now, what happens to me when I read books a lot that are in this area, or that are explaining an idea, is I'm like, oh yeah, that's great. Yeah, that's really, really great. And I keep on reading this, and I think it's great, and I think the ideas are like really profound. Maybe I don't know when the last time is I did this or whatever, maybe it was when I was younger I had more trouble with this. I don't know if I've had a lot of trouble with this in my recent years, but I'm reading this and I'm just like, oh yeah, that's awesome. And you get really excited about it. You know, when you read something that has really cool ideas that you've never thought about stuff before, it's kind of one of those books or one of those things you read and suddenly a light bulb goes on. You're like, whoa, like I never realized that before. That's a really, really cool look on the world. That seems to be correct. And then you go away and you go talk to somebody else and you're really, really excited. And I can't remember. I think I did actually. It doesn't happen as much to me anymore, but I think the last time it happened was a few months ago with my wife. I think I was talking to her and I was trying to explain something and I couldn't explain it. And she probably doesn't remember, but I do vaguely. But what happens is you go to somebody else and then you try to explain that thing just like I was saying. And suddenly you're trying to explain it, and you're like, yeah, I really, really understand it in my head, but then suddenly you don't. Like, suddenly you can't put the pieces together. Suddenly you try to explain it, and it comes out as, like, word salad or something like that, and then the person looks at you, and they look at you with, like, a blank stare, like, that, great, cool. You know when you ever tell a joke? It's kind of like telling a joke, and you tell the joke, and you think it's going to be great, and then the person just stares at you. Like, they don't understand the joke, or they just didn't like the joke, you know. That's the situation I'm talking about. You're explaining everything, but with the joke, you actually understand the joke and you're able to tell it. But with this concept you're trying to explain, you actually don't understand it well enough, so you can't explain it to the other person. Which brings us to, which is exactly what our rule is for this week. It may be a little short, actually. This week's episode may be a little short just because of the fact that it's such a simple rule, right? But I'm going to give you some tips on how you can work with this better and how you can actually make your writing better by using this rule too. So if you are dealing with a concept and you can't understand it completely, or you don't have all the information, maybe it's just a memory thing. Maybe you understand it completely, but you just have to let it set in your memory. Maybe instead of telling a friend or telling a family member or whatever, maybe instead of telling them right away what you understood and what you got into and the different things that you learned from it, maybe you should let it sit, read over it again, and try to understand it better so you can put all the pieces together, because you just don't have a good enough memory. Like that's probably my case. I don't have a good enough memory, and then I try to explain it to somebody else. Now, with the same thing can happen with stories. And I think this is something that people fall into a lot. Now, I really advocate outlining stories. If you're ever going to write a story and you're going to write a significantly long story, even if you just have the basic points of the story, I think it's really good to have them. And the reason why goes back to this rule. If you can't see it, you can't make your reader see it. Now, this is a little abstract in a way. Instead of you just being able to see something, it's more like if you don't know it, you can't make your readers know it. Okay? But that's the same thing. And with outlines, one thing that I found to be really useful is that if I make the outline, my mind starts making up stuff about it. Okay, I start thinking, it starts churning, and eventually, like when I get to that point in the outline, because you have to go through the whole entire thing. You have to go from the beginning to the end, and you have to go from the beginning to the end again, and your mind is filling in the blanks. But you aren't just dealing with nothing, okay? go back to that idea of the structure. Go back to that idea of the house. When you're making the outline, you're making the frame of the house, right? And without the frame of the house, you're not going to be able to build anything else. But if you are what do you call it? If you're building a house and you're building everything at once, right? You're building from the ground up everything at once. You're going to have to put the siding on. You're going to have to do this and that. You're going to start with one little piece, and then you're going to build everything about that piece. Then you're going to move on to the next, etc. And that's not going to work. And I think it's kind of the same thing with because there's a lot of different pieces that go onto that. It's a very complex process, and there's a lot of different things you have to take care of. But with when you just start with the outline, what it allows you to do, it allows you to take it allows you to take that information and create a really rough drawing of it, right? It's like a prototype drawing, and then every time you go through that, every time you write, so the first draft is like a prototype. The outline, I can't remember the word. The outline is the plans for the prototype. The first draft is the prototype itself, and you keep on refining that prototype until it works really well, if that makes sense. So I wonder how far are we? So we're at 15 minutes. I actually went really quickly. So how can you do this? How can you actually take this idea of, if you can't see it, then you're not going to make other people able to see it? Now, with nonfiction, it's a little simpler, because usually when you're writing nonfiction, everything's a little simpler because it's a lot more logical. And what it requires you to do with nonfiction is just read the material and understand it. And if you don't understand it right away, you're not going to probably be able to convey the ideas. So what I would suggest is that you do a careful read of it. And nonfiction, if you're trying to do a careful read of it and understand all of it and reiterate it somewhere else, it's going to take you a long time, which isn't very. It's not that it's not useful. It just probably don't have enough. It's not efficient enough, and I can't remember the stinking words. So that's what you need to do, right? I thought it was later than it was. I thought it was almost 4 o'clock, but it isn't. So you probably need to do a careful read and read it over again and read different perspectives so you can actually write in a way that makes sense. The only reason I can do this podcast, and most of the time I do an outline, or I do a show map, which is essentially an outline of the podcast. Most of the time I do a show map. Sometimes I don't, but the reason why I'm able to, if I don't do a show map, the reason why I'm able to talk about stuff like this without doing it is because I just have been exposed to this stuff so much. You talk to a kid who's obsessed with dinosaurs and they can tell you all about dinosaurs. If you talk to somebody, whatever field they're in, they can probably talk really extensively about their field. And the reason why they can do that is they've just been exposed to it so much. But the reason why they probably like to do that is because they feel like an expert in it. And I think it's good that people feel like experts in some area. So they probably can talk about it a lot and go into the nuances of it, which is going possibly into like formal operations like thinking about that concept, like with formal operations. I have a friend who's an engineer. Just a side note, going back to that last rule. I have a friend who's an engineer, and sometimes he talks to me and he uses terms that I don't understand. And I'm just like, I go along with it because I think it's kind of rude to be like, hey, I don't understand that, or be like, hey, your terms are too much. And I probably feel a little embarrassed maybe because I don't know what the terms mean. But if you deal with any technical thing, or whatever job you have, you need to dumb it down for everybody else. It's not that they're stupid. It's just that they don't have the terms you have. So, when you expose yourself enough to that area, you'll be able to talk about it in a good way. Now, it may be the case that you can only talk about it to experts. I think this happens to experts a lot. They get so engrossed and they get so they get so into the area they're into, just to put it really eloquently, that they can't talk about it to other people, which goes back to appealing to the senses of the last thing. So that's nonfiction, if that makes sense. You're just doing a lot of studying. You're doing a lot of reading. You're giving it time. You're giving yourself time to process that thing. Fiction is different. Like I said, start with an outline. I think that's a really good thing. Even if it's a really brief outline, even if you take one page and you write 5 lines down about what's going to happen. Now, the other part is actually from Steven Pinker, because I'm stealing a lot of things from this. Like, this is a lot of these rules, especially the first ones, are very heavy on his ideas. They rely heavily on his ideas in his book of style. But this one's actually from him. So if you are a fiction writer, if you're a creative writer, not just a fiction writer, this is what you can do. And I've talked about in the past how Stephen King called writing or fiction writing what's it called? Mesmerization. What's it called? Not memorization, mesmerism. You are mesmerizing yourself. There's another word for it. I can't remember. You're hypnotizing. It's a type of self-hypnotism. And maybe this is what he's talking about. I don't think this is a type of self-hypnotism, but it does require you to have a very good, have a good ability to kind of make yourself slip into like a different world. So what you do, if you're writing fiction, after you've got your basic you don't have to use a basic outline. You don't at all. But what you need to do is need to start thinking about your story, right? You need to start thinking about, very logically, you should think about the different things that are happening in your story. But if you just wrote a story with logic, it'd probably not be a very good story. It'd probably be like, oh yeah, this happened and then this happened, yada, yada, yada. The thing that makes a story good, besides the story structure, right? The story structures are good, but I think that's something that maybe people miss out on a lot, is the human part. You're actually drawn into that story. I've said time and time again, that writing itself, you're trying to make somebody think your thoughts after you, okay? And with nonfiction, you're trying to do that in a very logical and orderly way. With fiction, you're trying to make somebody experience something. You're making them think your thoughts, but it's going even beyond just thinking your thoughts and understanding something. What you're trying to do is make them see, make them hear, make them smell, make them think the thoughts of the characters themselves. So what does that require you to do? Well, that requires you to actually think the thoughts of the character, and it requires you to immerse yourself in what's going on in the story. How I do this, and you don't have to follow my specific example of this, but I think it really helps me. My stories are generally very character driven, and they rely a lot on the thoughts of the character. I just think it's really fun to go into the thoughts of the character and kind of expand on them. Orson Scott Card does this a lot, and I think that's where I started to be heavily influenced in that area. I thought it was really cool. And I started to do that, and I think maybe I go even beyond Orson Scott Card. Maybe I don't have the ability, but I go beyond with how much thinking and how in-depth with the thoughts of the characters I can be. But what I do is I actually imagine, I actually take time where you just go slip in. I do this with music a lot, and I probably have mentioned this. For me, I put on some headphones, I turn on some music, and I imagine what's going on in the story. And for lack of a better word, you can actually use the music, or I do, and you kind of create a little music video that's in relation to your story. And you can do this without music too. All you have to do is just let yourself relax and let yourself think, oh, what's happening in the story? What do I see? You're using your imagination and your creativity. You're using them both to just see something and experience something that you want you want other people to experience and see, right? Now, there's really two ways you can do this. You could just sit down and write, which I think is a harder thing to do. You could sit down and write, and you could lean back in your chair, and you could just imagine what's going on, and then you could write it, and then you could imagine what's going on, and you can write it. I think a better way to do this is, if you're ever doing something that you don't have to think when you do it, when you can just let your mind zone out, let your mind go to the story and just walk through what goes on in the story. And maybe you'll walk through the same thing over and over again. That might be the case. You might walk through it. You might see what's happening. You might see what's happening again. You might see what's happening again. You might see what's happening again. And you may just slowly make progress in thinking about what's going on in the story, or not even thinking about it, just experiencing what's going on in the story, if that makes sense. And what you can do with that is, all you do is you take that. I know teachers when they teach kids how to write, they call it a mind movie, which I think is a really dumb term. It just annoys me, I guess. It's just a pet peeve. It doesn't really matter. But they take the mind movie and they put that into. They take that and they start writing it down and what's happening in it. And when you've done this enough, or when you've done enough writing, you can actually start to write. And even if you're not doing really well when you're writing, this happens to me. Like, I start writing and I'm just like, man, I really don't want to. Most of the time, I really don't want to write when I start. I start writing, and suddenly I start getting into the story, and suddenly I start seeing that movie in my head, and suddenly I'm just flowing. Like, I'm just taking something that I'm seeing in my head and I'm putting it down on paper. So if you can certainly try to write, and you can certainly write and not see anything, right? If you can't see it, but you're just writing and you're making stuff up. But I think that's going to lack power. I think it's going to be very two-dimensional, and I think that it's not going to be satisfying to you. You really want to get to the heart of something. You really want to get to the heart of an experience, or you really want to get to the heart of how somebody feels, or what something feels like, or what's going on in the situation. And if you're able to see that situation, because if you're able to see something, it's automatically going to be easier to describe what that thing is, right? If I'm sitting down and I'm looking at something, it's going to be a lot easier to say, oh, this is what the thing is like, or you're trying to capture, or maybe this is a better example. If I'm in a specific situation and I have a specific feeling, it's going to be easier to convey that feeling, because we're really not necessarily trying to tell everybody about all the details of something. We're trying to capture that essence of the thing. We're trying to capture what the core of that thing is so somebody else can understand it, which I think is really at the heart of good writing. I think the heart of good writing is really trying to capture the essence of something, and somebody doesn't necessarily experience it like you experience it, but they do experience that. Maybe there's other parts that aren't the same, but they do experience that thing, right? They experience a dog, but the dog isn't actually the same exact dog, right? Or they experience fear, but it's a little bit more nuanced. It's nuanced toward them rather than being the exact same thing as you. So that's really what it is. You are trying to, going back to the rules, if you can't see it, you can't make your reader see it. And this is, besides just explaining it, I want to give you a way to actually use this. And this is a way you can actually use it. So if you're someone who's stuck, you're like, man, like I'm sick of writing. This really stinks. I'm tired of, maybe you're stuck in writing a paper and you don't know what to do. Well, you can use my first the information I did before that I talked about with nonfiction, where you just read and you just understand it better. And with that, you also need to just let your mind wander with it too, and then you get ideas, and that should help you write. But with fiction especially, I think people have a really hard time. And I've actually seen people, posts from people that are like, yeah, I used to really like writing, but now it's become a chore. And I think it's because they just don't allow their minds to wander, and they don't allow themselves to experience that disassociation, I think that's the right word, from reality, and allow themselves to just experience their story and see what the potential of it. Because then if you see it, you can see the potential, you can write down what's going on in that story. So this is my last of my 5 really, really important rules. So again, if you don't listen to anything else, I think that you should listen to these. Excuse me. Again, I'm gonna restate them, and I'm probably not gonna talk about them because I'm gonna probably go in groups of 5 and then groups of 4 at the end. So writing follows language, grammar serves meaning, people have short memories, appeal to the senses, and if you can't see it, you can't make your reader see it. And if you're like, man, like I don't know what to do with writing, I think that that's a good place to start to fall back on. There's a lot of other things with writing that are important, but I think that that's it's good to, like, you can be like, oh, I have perfect grammar, but just because you have perfect grammar doesn't mean you're a good writer, if that makes sense. Because there's more to writing. It's more organic. It's more aesthetic, right? It relies more on aesthetics, which is like the quality of something, rather than just, oh, this is logical. It's more than just logic. There is a baseline logic to writing. There's a baseline logic to talking and how we communicate, I believe. But at the same time, it's not gonna turn into good writing necessarily. All right, so I guess that brings us to our logical fallacy of the week. And this logical fallacy, I don't know if I've said this one before or not. I don't believe I have. It's called the continuum fallacy. And what it is that someone is rejecting a claim just because it's vague. So they're like, oh, that's not precise enough, therefore it must not be true. But just because it's not as precise as someone would like it to be just doesn't necessarily mean that it's incorrect. So that's our logical fallacy of the week. I actually have to make a quick, just tell you something quickly, and you may be like, maybe you didn't notice this at all, because I'm not certain. But I have a specific microphone that's better, and I just plugged in my microphone, and I just realized about at the 20-minute mark, so just realized, I realized that I actually didn't use the microphone I'm trying to use. So if this is a little quieter, it shouldn't be any quieter actually, but if it's a little more difficult to understand, or if it's a little less worse quality, it's because the microphone is a different one. But I got done, and I already had so much of the episode done already that I'm like, well, I guess I'm doing it with a bad microphone. It's not that bad. It doesn't sound that bad. All right, so that's all I've got for you this week. I know I didn't have I know I didn't have a guest on this month. I am going to have one next month, of course, and should continue to have them every single month at the end of the month. And next month I actually have a interesting guest. I really like having musicians. And for this next month, I actually have 2 musicians, 2 indie artists who are married, who actually live in different countries. So that'll be a lot of fun. And time got away from me this month, I guess. And I will always make sure there's an episode out, but sometimes it's hard to find someone to actually guest on the podcast. So as always, my name is Daniel Poppy, and this is How to Write Good.